All right. Thank you for joining me. We are going to take a look at the problems that inner cities in America face, problems that are more geared towards the CBD. And then at the end of this, then we'll take a look at um, the kind of some of the problems that LDC cities are facing. Now, the first slide asks you to go to the binder, and I would encourage you to do that. But I'm going to kind of give you some verbal highlights of what you're going to see when you go to pages 735 to 737. And it talks there about what's called a census tract. So let's back up just a little bit. We talked about this earlier in the year about what a census is. But a census is an important term that we need to know, and it is a count by the government of the population. And the reason that the government does this is that they want to get information on you. They want to get information on how many people are in your household, if your parents are married, how much money they make, um, the median price of homes in your particular area. And so what they do is they break up communities into populations of 5,000, and they call that a census tract. And when they take all that information, what the government really wants to do there is they want to understand how they need to allocate resources. So, for example, if they take a census tract of 5,000 people over in our community here, what they're going to find is that the vast majority of households are single family dwellings that are average price around $650,000, that most of your parents have remained married, and that when it comes to the collection of tax dollars, the government doesn't have to allocate a lot of resources out in this area for things like unemployment, for things like welfare, and they can allocate funds for things like infrastructure or schools or something like that. But if we take our census tract and we compare it to a census tract over, say, off of, I don't know, Federal Boulevard or something like that, Federal Boulevard over on West Denver, where a lot of the residents are living in small single family homes or apartments. It is likely that they are, families with one parent because they've had divorce. They're low income families, and the government feels like they need to allocate more tax dollars to that side of Denver. And so, put more money into schools there, put more money into roads and into welfare systems and things like that. So that's a census tract, and it helps the government to be able to deal with issues of their city a little bit better. Next, we're going to talk about kind of the process of deterioration that goes on in inner cities. And so we talked about this a little bit before, but as cities deteriorate, what we typically have happen is that the wealthier citizens are going to move to the outside of the urbanized area, and that the low income people will fill in the gaps where the middle class people lived. And we call this invasion and succession. And typically in America, that leads to the ethnic clustering of Hispanic people, of African Americans, and of other types of immigrants. Um, the other thing that happens down in those downtown areas is that because the bid rent is so high, a lot of these groups that move in, they cannot afford a single family dwelling. And, furthermore, that the house is deteriorated to the point that the landowner feels like there's a better way to make income on that property. And because wealthier people don't typically want to live in those situations, what they'll do is they'll knock down the single family dwelling and they'll build apartments like you see on the screen below. And that way they can get multiple rents for one piece of property. And that's called filtering. Filtering is the switching over from single family dwellings to apartments in a particular part of the city. So this is something that happens in almost every American city, is this process of deterioration, invasion, and succession by lower income people. And then from the homeowner's point of perspective, they want to make money off the property because it is valuable property close to the CBD. And so they will demolish the single family dwelling and put up apartments. Now, the government recognizes this as a problem. And from time to time, starting in the 60s with Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty, and continuing on from time to time, the government, they will go through this process of what they call urban renewal. And so they have urban renewal plans where they create what is known as public housing. And effectively, urban renewal creates public housing for low income people. Effectively, these are government-owned apartments that are subsidized. And what that means is, and typically how they do this, let's say that you make $1,000 per month. The government will say, okay, well, you are going to give 30% of your income, which would be $300 in this case, to go towards rent. And whatever that $300 doesn't cover towards rent, then we will pick up the rest of that so that you can have at least a minimum place for you or your family to stay. And so in our example, let's say that rent is $600 and you make $1,000. So the government's going to put 300 of that, 30% towards that $600. The government's going to come in and pay the other $300. That's how they subsidize housing. And that's how they make sure that even poor income people can stay in an apartment. The problem is that over 20 or 30 years, the government oftentimes is not willing to put money into updating and renovating public housing. And so the great irony is that public housing begins to look like the apartments that had deteriorated in the first place. And so it's what we call a vicious cycle of poverty. The people that live in poverty can't get out of it, and the situation keeps perpetuating itself over and over again. So here's some pictures of public housing in the top left corner. That's probably about the nicest public housing you're ever going to see. This one looks like it's fairly new, and then over time it starts to look like, what you see in the other pictures. So the one in the bottom left-hand corner was in Newark, New Jersey, and it basically just has turned into a tenement. In the middle picture, I want you to focus on the middle picture. This was the Robert Taylor housing project, and at one point it was the largest housing project in the entire country. At its zenith, there was, I think, 29 total buildings that made up the urban housing project. And so you're talking about a big, huge conglomeration of low-income people living in one place. All right, what does tenement or kind of public housing look like in other places in the world? Well, one of the things that you're going to look at in your assignment that you did earlier on the structure of cities outside of the U.S. This would be a good example of Eastern Europe, where they had these things during the Cold War and the Soviet Union times of what are called micro districts. And so what the Soviet Union would do is they'd build these tenements, which just look like our housing projects, and they would be low income subsidized housing, really not any different. And then these people oftentimes would work in the local factory. Eastern Europe was kind of the industrial center for the Soviet Union. And so they would build these micro district apartments like right next to the factories that the Soviet Union was trying to produce steel or chemicals or whatever else they were trying to produce. So those are called micro districts, but really it's just public housing public housing that the Soviet Union built during the Cold War. Okay, well, this process of deterioration, of invasion and succession, it all leads to this what's called ghettoization of the urban areas. Now, if we go back, we've actually had this term ghetto back when we talked about ethnicity. And remember that originally the term ghetto was used by the Romans to describe an area that they had reserved for Jewish people within their empire. And so Jews, because at the time Romans were polytheistic and the Jews were monotheistic, one of the few groups that were actually monotheistic, they were very different from the beliefs of the Romans. And so the Romans kind of quarantined the Jews into a certain section of their cities, and they had a term for that area where the Jews had to go, and that was called the ghetto. And Americans have taken the term ghetto and basically said, well, this is where our undesirable people live. And so just like the Romans did that to the Jews, now, the United States has basically done this to minority groups. And that's really sad, but that's where the term comes from. Okay. Now, whatever color, ethnicity, creed you are, the people that live in these ghettoized situations, they are part of a group of people in America called the underclass. And the underclass are just this group of urban poor people that are just trapped in a vicious cycle of poverty. And they can't get out. And if they have children, their children are highly likely to stay trapped in this vicious cycle of poverty. And a lot of that is due to the lack of education, um, drug use, the history of criminal activity, unemployment. And another thing that you'll typically see if you go down to downtown and you see the underclass is that a lot of these people are dealing with mental illness, and they're dealing with mental disorders or stress or trauma of some past experience in their life, and they can't get out, and the system, it seems, kind of keeps them down. So let me just go really quickly. So you've probably seen people like this in our downtown areas, but these are people that are the underclass. You can see, they're always taking like shopping carts around with their stuff. You'll see them put up makeshift tents and tarps, going through the trash, people like this, and for whatever reason, they're kind of trapped in that cycle of poverty. Typically, the underclass lives a lot of times in zones of abandonment. And the reason that they live in these zones of abandonment is because people kind of tend to leave them alone. So if you look at, the picture in the top right hand corner, you can see an old abandoned, basically, tenement. These are places where they can oftentimes just stay for free. But I'm going to put up kind of the next term too. Whenever you talk about a zone of abandonment, you are probably simultaneously talking about a zone of disamenity, which means there's few, if any, services available. So, like if we look at that building, there's probably not running water, there's probably not electricity, there's probably not working plumbing or something like that. Um, and it can get to the point where if let's say there's a shooting or something in that particular building, that it's possible that the police might not even come to that area because there's not taxpayers in that area. I mean, the area's kind of been abandoned, and so police and fire and ambulance, they typically go where they're being supported by tax dollars. If there's not tax dollars coming into an area like this, then they may not even come there. And probably one of the more famous places that we've seen this happen is in New Orleans, Louisiana. There's a place called the Third Ward in Louisiana, and there's been instances where literal gunshots have been fired, and people try to call the police, and the police don't go because it's too dangerous, and there's not a lot of taxpayers in that area. So if you get that, then you get this what's called zone of disamenity. And so these are the totally just dilapidated, rundown parts of the urban areas that you really don't want to be in. Now, luckily for you here in Denver, we don't really have too much of this. There might be an abandoned building here or there, but we really don't have it to the extreme of some American cities, like like a St. Louis or a New Orleans, or some of these really poor cities that can be there. We don't really have that here in Denver, so we're kind of lucky for that. Again, you can see these buildings. This is more likely what you're going to see in Denver, is just a couple of like abandoned, rundown buildings. But they would probably be lacking services. When you get a bunch of them together, like you can kind of see on the right, that's when you start to get that zone of abandonment. And this can also happen too, where and unfortunately for New Orleans, they kind of get double whammied because they also get hurricanes, and so sometimes people just flat out abandon certain areas that are in floodplains, and then drug users and just homeless people will move into these old abandoned houses because it's a roof over their head. Okay, so the underclass, they are, they're kind of in this cycle of poverty, but there's also institutional things that keep some of these people, especially minorities, into a cycle of poverty. There's literally things that are done by people that try to put people down. And one of those things historically in America that's done that is something called blockbusting. Now, blockbusting is, and I don't mean to insult any parents that you may have that are real estate agents, but back in the 60s and 70s and 80s, when blockbusting was widely used, and a tactic that was done to maximize the amount of profit that the real estate agents could make. Now this is totally illegal, by the way. You cannot do blockbusting anymore. But what blockbusting is when a real estate agent tries to convince people that they need to sell their house. And of course, the reason they need to sell their house is because that gives the real estate agent a commission. But what they'll do is they'll use a scare tactic. They'll say, hey, look, your house is getting a little bit older, and we've kind of noticed in some other parts of your neighborhood or your area that this group or that group, minority groups or undesirable people are starting to move into your neighborhood, and it's starting to bring down your property value. And so you better strike while the iron's hot before your property value continues to decline. You need to sell your house. And that fear that real estate agents would put into the white middle class, for example, that would get them to sell. And um, that's discriminating against minority groups. Another thing that would happen, and this one's more with banks than it is the real estate agents, but a practice called redlining. Now you have to understand that the way that banks make money, believe it or not, is by loaning money out. So when you put money into a bank, they're not just holding on to it until until you want it back. They're taking that money and loaning out. And as long as everybody doesn't come to the bank at the same time, they're okay. And so they loan money out. And if you think about who they're more likely to loan money out to, it's the people that they think are going to pay them back. And so let me just fast forward here to this picture. What banks used to do is they would draw a line around certain neighborhoods where they thought that, hey, we should not loan money out to these people because it's highly unlikely they'll pay us back. And so they would literally draw like a red line on a map saying, okay, we're not going to loan to anybody in this area. Um, and unfortunately, the groups of people that they would exclude from getting loans would be Black people, Hispanic people, and immigrants. And so you're loan discriminating. And when these people can't have access to credit, well, then they can't afford like a decent place to live, and they have to live in zones of abandonment or something like that. And so you're kind of effectively in both blockbusting and redlining, you're discriminating against minorities, and you're doing something in the city that kind of keeps them trapped in the cycle of poverty. All right. Now, one of the things that the government could do if they had the ability would be to take more land, create a new area in the city, build public housing, build new public housing, and be able to give poor people a place to stay. But unfortunately, these cities, they've agglomerated so closely together that there's not any new land for cities to access or to what's called annex. The general rule of annexation is that if you want to claim more land for your city, you have to be adjacent to it. It has to be touching. And unfortunately for like the city of Denver, it's really difficult because they are completely surrounded by Aurora and Highlands Ranch and Littleton and Lakewood, and there's not really room to move out for the city of Denver. Because if they, for example, if the city of Denver, if they wanted to create more tax dollars and they were able to um, take over certain land and then build new housing on it, they could draw people in that could afford to live in that housing, and then they could provide tax dollars based on those property taxes to give back to the urban decayed areas that are struggling for the minorities. But unfortunately, they're not typically able to do that, and that's a real problem. Is that cities just don't have available land to annex unless they're sitting on the outside. Now, if you look at like Aurora definitely has land on the outside to annex. It's not a problem for them. I'm more talking about the inner city like Denver. That has been historically an issue for Denver. Okay, one of the biggest problems in America today is what we call the feminization of poverty of the underclass. And so, what we mean is that disproportionately, if we take a look at inner city residents, a high proportion of inner city residents tend to be single moms. And these are moms that probably have multiple dependents. And unfortunately, you get a lot of deadbeat dads that get females pregnant and then they don't marry the females. They go off somewhere else. And the moms are likely to move closer to the CBD because that's where they have rundown apartments where they can afford to live. They can't afford to live out in the suburbs, of 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 square foot houses because they just can't afford that on their own. And so if you think about it, if we go closer to the CBD in those zones of transition or low income houses around the CBD, if it's not been flipped or if it's not been gentrified, those old decaying inner city places, they're likely to be filled with single moms with multiple kids. And that's really sad. And so this is what has happened in America is that single moms are highly likely to live near the CBD in America, work multiple jobs, not have a college degree, live under the poverty line, which currently sits around $20,000 per year. And then, unfortunately, here's the bad one. This is the kind of that vicious cycle of poverty. Have children that repeat similar statistics. If you guys take a look at inner city versus suburban schools, who's likely to get the better tax revenue? And this is why it's difficult for Denver not being able to annex new land, because if they could annex new land and build better housing, you're going to attract higher income residents who will then generate more property taxes for things like schools and hospitals and fire and police and all those other services. And you can see on the left, there's Denver West High School on Spear Boulevard, as opposed to this brand new, Rock Canyon High School in suburban Highlands Ranch. Okay, for this last part here, we are going to focus on problems of inner cities in LDCs. And so one of the things that we're seeing in these, especially the mega cities, remember the mega cities are any kind of cities that have a population of over 10 million. A meta city is one with a population of over 20 million. And there's not that many of those on Earth, but we typically see that in LDCs, this is where the problem is the most difficult. Now, a lot of these cities are primate cities. And so this is where if you think you're able to get a job in the city, this is the city that you're going to get it. So if we're talking about like the picture on the left, this is Rio de Janeiro. So if you're in Brazil, really there's two major cities that you can go to get a job, and that's Sao Paulo, Rio de Janeiro. The problem is the population is growing so fast that even though this is where there are the most jobs, there's not a job for everybody. And so there's not a place for everybody to live. There's not enough electric lines. There's not enough sewer lines. And so people will start butting themselves up as closely as they can get to the urbanized area. And then they will start, tapping into those services illegally. And so here you can see on the bottom left, this is what's called a favela, but which really is just a tenement. It's an urban slum. It's a squatter settlement. These people are living here without, even renting the land. They're just making a makeshift shack, and then they're illegally tapping into the electric lines. And if you take a look at those electric lines, that is just a fire hazard waiting to happen. And since these places are zones of disamenity, it's likely that if it caught on fire, that the fire police protection is not going to come to this area. So typically, if you live on the edge of these urbanized areas, so I want you to picture this in your mind. You've got the CBD, you've got the suburban urban areas, and then right at the edge in LDCs, those squatter settlements, those favelas, those slums. That's where they're going to butt up right next to, because that's where they can tap into the sewers. That's where they can illegally tap into the electric lines. The other thing that typically happens in these these mega city slums is the development of an informal economy. And so if you take a look at these squatter settlements, people still need services. So there might be a person that comes around with bottled water, and there might be a person that comes around, trying to huck this or sell that, or doing something just to make, pennies on the dollar or something like that. So like a little food truck or a food stand, or a recycle place, or just whatever people can do to make any kind of money. You'll oftentimes see that people will go over trash heaps, so unsanitary landfills in LDCs, and then they will go through the slums and they will, try to sell things for a couple pennies here, a couple dollars there, and that's how they make money. Now, oftentimes this leads to, better ways to make money that are unfortunately more illegal and more nefarious, and that would be things like gambling, prostitution, illegal fighting, these different vices where you can make money quickly. And so, the selling of illegal drugs would be a good example of that. And that's all part of what we call the informal economy. The informal economy is any kind of economic activity that is not taxed or regulated by the government. And sure, we have an informal economy here in the United States, but not to the degree that we see them in LDCs, and certainly not to the degree that we see them in LDC slums, where there's a lot of economic activities that are not being regulated by the government. So we're very likely to see those activities happen in LDCs, slums. And so here you can see a picture of one of the largest slums in the world. There's over 1 million residents in this slum in Mumbai. And so if you kind of take a look at where that slum ends, it's butting itself right up next to that urbanized area. And all these people live in these little makeshift shacks. So what you guys are going to do, you're going to watch a little TED Talk in Schoology. You can, you're finished with this for right now. What I would like you guys to do is to go into Schoology and then go into videos, and there should be a video link for a little thing on slums. So I'd like you to watch that. All right. Thank you for joining in today.